Welcome to Regents Roundtable. I'm Stephen Ludwig. My guest today is Jennifer Mersmen. Jennifer is the Assessment and Research Officer at California State University, San Bernardino. She is an expert in program evaluation, which is really important to board members. Her job is to create models for continuous improvement to give campus leaders important data about campus programs. Most critically, are they working? Do they have the desired impact that we wanted them to have on students? She provides leadership and capacity building for assessment and is passionate in developing leaders to create improvement within their own areas. Jennifer holds her MS in industrial and organizational psychology and earned her PhD in organizational psychology from Claremont Graduate University. Before coming to higher education, Jennifer worked in education management, weaving assessment and development into whole systems change in service of learner success. She has also worked as an evaluation consultant over the last 2 decades, working with multiple groups within the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. Jennifer, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, great. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. Most Board of Regents or trustees struggle with what they should use as key performance metrics or dashboard indicators or key performance indicators, whatever they call them. And they want to know if their institution is doing well, so they set them up and across a number of areas. Now, when I was a regent at the University of Colorado System, we implemented a number of indicators, and most of them were lagging. These included very common ones like graduation rates, the persistence of first-year students, diversity enrollment funding, what have you. And to be honest, we were using ones that the university already had to produce for other, like the government or rankings or accreditation. So they were helpful for the board, but only so much. That's why I'm excited to have you here on the podcast. That's a long voice. Sorry, that's such a long lead up. I'm excited to have you on the podcast today so you can help us better understand what measurements can help us with and understand the health of any institution or program, right? So this is a super simple conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of good topics, each one of them worthy of a podcast in their own right.
Fair enough. First of all, you're relatively new to higher education. Because you have fresh eyes, which is really, really helpful. You can see things that those of us have been in the trenches for a long time have stopped seeing or stopped noticing. What are some of the things that comes to evaluating programs for student outcomes that we might be stuck in some old ways of thinking that you've seen?
Yeah, sure. So coming into higher ed kind of from, multiple perspectives, I think the thing that struck me, at least in the context of where I'm at in Southern California for a state school, was mainly limiting our outcome frameworks to only student learning outcomes, or what we call SLOs. So assessment of learning is critical. I mean, this is what we're all about in higher ed. But I think when you're looking at outcome assessment, includes, but not limited to, the student learning outcomes. And not every question can be answered with the SLO. So I think what this does is really narrow the diversity of thought and the practice of assessment and excludes a lot of stakeholders on campus. Like when I was working in the non-academic divisions for my folks in ITS or admin and finance, it was difficult for them to connect to like a traditional technical student outcome. As a result of our services, students will be able to do X, Y, Z. And that was the only framework that was really what they were kind of latching onto. So what we decided to do was really broaden our assessment framework and language about outcomes to have a wider on-ramp to invite more folks into, include, more people at the table besides just kind of the academic affairs people. So we can look at programs, outcomes, process outcomes to give a more comprehensive picture of the learning and the effects of learning. So for example, a student learning, well, I don't have to go into an example. People listening to this would know what SLOs and things like that are, but really trying to get a more common language and invite more people into the practice of self-reflection. I'm also, another thing, a big advocate for rethinking student outcomes in terms of the extent to which students themselves value the outcomes on which their learning is being assessed. So traditionally, the assessment of teaching and learning is framed again around these SLOs, like I mentioned, but they're important because they outline the critical aspects that needs to be learned in a particular subject area. So I'm not eschewing them as having importance. I'm saying that they are not sufficient in some cases. So new ways of thinking about pedagogy in higher ed, we know, is involving students as partners and repositioning students as really active collaborators in that diverse process of teaching and learning. So we can better empower students to be actively engaged in and share the responsibility for their own learning. And we do this in evaluating programs and services from their own perspectives. So I think how we do this is, yes, it's assess learning, but over and above that, ask the students the meaning and the value that they have for these outcomes. So, for example, the extent to which do you feel that you learned something valuable? The extent to which that you've learned to what have you been able to use what you've learned to make a positive impact in your own life or the life of others? How much has your viewpoint become developed or changed? And this is asking the students, this is partnering them rather than that expert model. I've decided as the expert in my field what you're going to be assessed on in a direct way. So I know that people who are steeped in this more traditional direct versus indirect measures debate, which I really could soapbox on for a long time about subjectivity and objectivity, that's not what this podcast is about. But it's the point is that I think faculty are really becoming more interested in partnering with students, at least the faculty that I've been talking to, and they need scaffolding around this. Like, how do we do this? And permission to do it, and roadmaps for doing that, and really tapping it into the student voice when it comes to their learning. And I think this really enhances diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI in the classroom and beyond, because it widens the avenues to passion about a subject rather than
So
simply
let
passing
me
a test or a class.
so let me just make sure I'm understanding correctly. So when we're talking about, so the first level of evaluation is a grade. I mean, that's super old school, top
Mhm.
level. I decided how well you did in the subject. What you're talking about, if I'm hearing you correctly, is asking the students, probably beyond the typical faculty course questionnaire, the series of questions that you just mentioned. What did you get out of it? Did your thinking change? This sort of thing. And the faculty can use that information to inform how they continue to evolve their own practice.
It could be used formatively or summatively. So the example you just gave is like the faculty is going to adjust their pedagogy, their methodology according to what they're learning about their students, which is super important, because if you're not getting feedback and you just keep doing the same thing, you don't know what kind of effect that's having. But also, I think why couldn't it be more summatively? Why couldn't we sample that across classes in our campus and have an aggregate like this proportion of students feel that this stuff is valuable? I think that's interesting outcome at the
So
institute.
you'd go like the philosophy majors, the English majors, the
Good.
business majors. So as a group,
I think
what's
it
your
depends on what your
experience?
assessment question is.
Got
So
it.
if you are looking at some program degree program developments, I mean, you could slice this in any number of ways. So that's why I don't really get caught up in the summative formative, because I think all evaluation
Okay,
can be
so I'm
formative.
sorry. Help me out with
So
summative meaning.
formative evaluation, summative or formative assessment is used to help you tweak as you're going along and help your learning. Whereas summative is like that grade, is that lag indicator. Like, this is it. This is the grade that you get. There's nothing we can do about it, and move on. So that's what
Okay.
I mean. Like, is it helpful for feedback and improving practice, or is it that, like you said, that grade where it's summary uh, determination of your achievement on something?
Right. So you brought up something that I hadn't thought about, which would be very helpful. It would have been helpful earlier on when I was a board member, is this idea of how do we, so at the University of Colorado, that's my experience. You're Cal State University, a very large campus there. So some of our larger campuses and smaller campuses, how are the business operations going? How do we help them evaluate their function and their contribution to the institution, even though they might not have it, as you articulated so well, might not have that direct impact on this, like student retention, diversity, that kind of thing that we're typically looking at. So what have you seen? You mentioned you worked with some people then in the non-academic units. What are some of the things you were measuring there that proved to be really helpful for individuals?
So I think it always depends on meeting people where they're at, because this was
Yeah.
new. I mean, we were coming in at an accreditation cycle where the call was like, do outcome assessment better. We were going to get a 10-year accreditation. We've got to do well on this, which we did. And part of that was really mapping out what a culture of continuous improvement assessment can look like. So this wasn't just about like, we're going to hit all these practices, everyone's going to have an assessment plan, boom, we passed accreditation. That's kind of minimally compliant what we have to do. Beyond that, we really wanted to create a culture of self-reflection. So you meet people where they're at. What are your wonderings about your area? So if you want to know about your operations, what's your question? We can assess that. We can measure that. If because we had such a big call to tie everything to student outcomes, which is important, and to learners, we talked about what is your linkage, your chain of outcomes as they impact our stakeholders, whether that's students, faculty, or staff. So these administrative, it's not just students, right? The ITS is helping faculty as well as helping students. So it could be any number of things, how your work affects others. So that was really, I think, eye-opening for a lot of administrative staff. Was like, we don't have to write student learning outcomes, because that's kind of what they were stuck in. It's like, we can look at our business operations, we can look at maybe a new program, we can look at our culture. I know I worked with ITS looking at how they were kind of shaping their pillars, their values for innovation and people first and customer service, and how that impacts their stakeholders. So that's a really long way of saying it depends and yes.
Okay. What I failed to do up top that I'd like to go back to is talk about, just so, because we're going to have people with very different experiences listening to us today. So we're talking about evaluation. Some of it's qualitative, right?
Mhm.
Is that survey data? Like,
Depends
how
on
do you
what-
feel about, okay. So
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt you. There's qualitative, quantitative. Those are your measurements. Those are
Okay.
your right.
So qualitative is going to be fill out the survey A, B, C, or 1 through 5, or 1 through 7, or most likely, more
see,
likely.
actually, people think survey data is more quantitative, and then if they tack on an open-ended question, oh, now we've got qualitative data. And I know that there's qualitative researchers out there that are just cringing as we say this, because it's not a really in-depth ethnography. There's this whole paradigm war history between qualitative and quantitative, but it's good to have a mixed method design or multiple measures
Okay,
using a
so
number.
qualitative would be what?
So typically what we have used in student affairs that would be qualitative would be like those open-ended focus groups, case studies. We don't rely on those enough, I think. And that's because people are looking for the quick answer in a number. Something about a number gives primacy to something. So, and this will get into kind of our discussion about KPIs. So I think that there's a way to use both that enriches both, because none of them tell the exact story. You need them in combination.
Got it. Okay, because I get like how important this is, and that what you mentioned, continuous learning. So if I'm in IT, or I'm in some other support function, how my culture is, how people are experiencing the work, that's very important. How are our end users, the faculty, staff, whomever, feeling about our work, and then using that information to improve.
And you can do that systematically. It's not just like anecdotal, less quality evidence. I think if you come into it with an inquiry and a systematic way to get diverse viewpoints, and not just kind of a small sample of a few viewpoints, this
Mhm.
is very helpful for us to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening. You talk to the people closest to the work about the work.
Yeah, and it seems to also, there's a natural inclination in a workplace that the squeaky wheel gets the grease,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the very loud complainers might think, oh, we have a problem, but it might be incomplete, or it might be inaccurate. And what you're talking about, a more formal evaluation process, would give us a fuller picture of that.
Yes, and that you include your squeaky wheels in the evaluation process.
Yeah.
You really want them to be looking at that evidence with you and coming up with valid conclusions. You don't want just kind of the usual suspects, right? And speaking the party line.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting, as we're talking, is as a board member, and I know you're not dealing with boards in your current position, but sometimes I don't know what questions to ask. And I know the biggest thing, there's two things. One, when we're going to talk about this, is like, what you measure gets done. But the other thing is, like, sometimes I'm not even aware of what things we should be asking. What advice would you have to a leader in higher education, whether a department leader, a campus leader, what have you, a board member, of how to frame, like, oh, what are we trying to figure out here?
Yes.
I know that's a very big question.
That is a very big question. So I'm trying to think of a really concrete example. And I think that goes into like the KPI discussion, because we want that simplicity. We want everything condensed into a metric, and that seems to like give us the way. So, is that answering a question that you have? Is it
Yeah.
because I think like the pressure that's put on universities, via the board, from the board through the president and all the way down, is move that needle on the graduation rate.
Hmm.
Right. That's, I think, the biggest pressure that I
Big
know
one.
that
Yeah.
we're dealing with in the state system. So, okay, so you go tell your people, all right, scatter, go move the needle on the. So now everyone has to use their own disciplines and evidence-based ways of this is what I'm reading as in the literature as what's affecting the graduation rate. So we focus on DFWI. Okay, so now we need to reduce the number of courses that have Ds, S, withdrawals, and incompletes. Okay, how do we do that? Well, then we're in a game of whack-a-mole, right? We kind of move faculty around and nothing ends up changing. And then 3 years later, the needle's not really moving. So I think we need to kind of stop this black box thinking and think about what are those interim steps? What are the linkages that affect upstream the downstream things? So you kind of have to have more of a, dare I say, scientific or systematic way to question this. And at the 60,000 foot level of a board, you're not typically thinking about those linkages. Your job is to be at those high level
Hmm.
indicators, and you leave the operations to your boots on the ground in the universities. But I think that understanding context and that things are multi-determined, and I'm fine with simplicity as long as it's on the other side of complexity. So you have to ask a lot of hard questions up to that, getting through, whittling through the complexity of it, a huge bureaucratic institution and all the human behavior therein. And then you kind of get to a valid, informed level of parsimony and simplicity on the other side. But people kind of want to skip that. And they just want to get to the, just give me the numbers. That's the meaning of everything. And now that takes the place of definitions, which really shouldn't happen.
Right. So it's interesting to think about. I know in a previous interview, I interviewed Robert Scott, who's a former college and university president, and he shared that only 15% of higher ed board members generally have a background in higher education. So understanding that system that you're talking about and all the threads that go into impacting every other thing, sometimes it's harder for board members to get in that. So having that long conversation about, what are the systems going on that are going to impact that? So we mentioned KPIs a couple times. So let's just get into that. So as we mentioned, as a regent or a trustee or a university leader, we often think that if we just get the right indicator of some metric, that will keep the university on track. And as I said earlier, what gets measured gets done. There's a great book that came out in 2018 called The Tyranny of Metrics by Jerry Mueller. And it made the case of how people can game measurement systems all the time. And they use some really great examples of, well, your stats went up, but it had a lot of unintended consequences that weren't necessarily positive. What are some of the problems when we rely too heavily on okay, here's a key performance indicator or metric, whatever we call it, and here's another one, and those are our be all end all. So what are the challenges we get into that black and white thinking?
So, Steve, I'm pretty certain we could talk about this for the entirety of our time together. So I'll try to keep it high level. But I mean, anyone listening to this should be familiar with KPIs, key performance indicators. And really, those are just a set of measures that are ostensibly critical for the success of an organization. So the historical timeline of this, they're management tools. And you quoted Drucker there, what gets measured gets done. So it really starts with Peter Drucker in the 60s for management by objectives, morphing into SMART goals sometime in the 80s, followed by the corporate world becoming enamored by these KPIs, thanks to Kaplan and Norton, the balanced scorecard in the 90s. Now, we can have a bunch of MBAs call in and might correct my rough timeline of that. But the point of it is that there's an evolution to this. And the point is that it's a management tool, these KPIs, for organizational performance, typically visualized in some sort of dashboard. Oh, we love our dashboards, right? In higher ed and elsewhere. And rightly so, because we really do need a snapshot to pilot our way. And if we extend this pilot our way, you think of these KPIs as instrumentation in a cockpit, right? We're looking at gauges to keep us on track for a successful flight and a successful landing. But we got to remember that the pilot isn't concentrating on any one of those gauges at a time. he or she is using their professional judgment to integrate and synthesize what all these gauges mean for the successful flight and landing of the plane. And it really takes skill and facilitation to do some sense making around what those indicators are telling you. And this is where KPIs can fall short, because there's not typically a lot of sense making happening around them across a wide range of stakeholders. I would say, I don't know if you would agree, it's typically a top down, not grassroots and all out from the middle. And you mentioned gaming the system, and I really think this is one of the main drawbacks of using indicators. So a couple examples, you think of the Soviet state-run nail factory that instituted a standard for measuring performance, which was, we're going to weigh the nails. And so what did they change their manufacturing processes to produce really heavy nails, but not too many of them. So that's not quality product. So then management comes back and says, we'll change our standard to counting the nails. And so they change the process to producing a lot of nails so that they can hit that quota, but there are a bunch of useless nails. So you're not getting the outcome that you want. The other one that I love to use is maybe not politically correct, but when British government in India, the whole cobra problem, they wanted to reduce the amount of venomous snakes in India and offered a reward for every dead cobra brought in. Well, people got wise to this because, you got to make a living. So you kind of get innovative and you think, okay, I'll breed some cobras and bring them in for the income. And the authorities likewise get wise to this and they stop paying the bounties. So now you got a bunch of worthless snakes released back into the wild, and you're exact opposite than what was intended, right? You wanted to reduce the poisonous venom population. Now you have more. So that's what you were talking about, like unintended consequences, gaming the system. So how does this play out in higher ed? Well, I think in a number of ways, unintentional. I'm not saying this is like evil and people wake up.
No, we're not assigning bad intent.
And I think it's natural human behavior because we are operating in systems of oppression, and we try to really find relief in some of these systems when we can't change them. So I do understand that there's human behavior behind it. So one of the more innocent examples I've seen at an institution would be like having a center or a program offering services, maybe for faculty or students for some development. And the director there is really pressured to obtain attendance data. And because their boss is like, I need that monthly report of how many people you served. And because every annual report includes this. How many people have you served? How many people came in through the door? Well, that director's like, yes, counting every person that comes in the door. Maybe that kind of goes into, okay, they delivered a ream of paper. I'm going to count the sign in. You're here to give a workshop, sign in. So now you're artificially inflating your participation rate, which I guess makes you look good, but that's just an indicator, right? And because what gets measured gets focused on. They're overly focusing on this indicator when really it's not telling you anything about how the people who came through the doors for services are changed by your services. So yeah, I guess this is why I think when you're focusing on outcomes, meaning how people are changed, is a little bit better than when you put the indicator on the throne over and above those indicators.
Yeah.
So I think
one of the ones that, sorry to interrupt, one of the ones that I always felt was sort of a bogus indicator that we used. That's very common. How many of our students went on to graduate school? How many students went on to law school? And it's like, oh, aren't we good? It's like, well, the input that we had, because we had more selective admissions than the college down the road, you're obviously the odds are higher that these students are going to continue on to these other programs. It doesn't mean that we added a lot of value, but that we pretend we do. It's the same for like, well, this many people passed the bar at a law school. It's the same thing. And the other thing that's a challenge is, the difference between measuring inputs and outcomes, right? So your example of they measured input, like how many people did you serve? Well, okay. How many people saw something you did? All right. Well, that's not an impact necessarily. Yeah. So how do you get sophisticated? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it's not that you shouldn't measure that. That's absolute, like, I want to know the reach. I would like to know how many people, but it's the level of sophistication that stops there. It's like, and now what? And then how were they changed? So it's one piece of the puzzle that you want to know, but it doesn't just stop there. And I think that's where you kind of do the capacity building to get people to realize, okay, you've measured how many people came. Now can we get to measuring how they were changed and the learning gain if it was a developmental program? And I think that's really the other issue that I have with KPIs is that they're they're indicators, not dictators. And I think people kind of when they're don't have that level of sophistication and knowledge behind it, they don't understand that they're proxies and that they're simplified measures of a phenomenon that are less simple. So we're human. We like heuristic. We need to make our cognitive lives easier. I park at the same place at Costco every time I go because I need my cognitive life made easier. I get this.
I do the same thing. Yeah.
So, this is the same thing with these KPIs. Okay, it's simple. Just give me the number. But I think, when you're asking a evaluative question, let's think of something like hamburgers. I'm in California. I like In-N-Out, but we have McDonald's, America's favorite burger. So we ask, who makes the better burger? Mickey D's or In-N-Out. And so if we look at an indicator like number sold, what's McDonald's like in the billions? I don't know.
Always, yeah.
And then you look at In-N-Out, probably in the millions. Okay. So if you just look at that, obviously In-N-Out's not the better burger, but what let's flesh out what we mean by good burger. We might want to add measures of satisfaction with the quality, brand loyalty. Have you ever seen anyone wearing McDonald's merch? I see people wearing In-N-Out merch in New Zealand. So, that's global. Satisfaction with the service, do the net promoter score. Are they telling friends and family, I really like In-N-Out, let's go to In-N-Out. So the point is that the number of burgers sold as an indicator does not define what makes a good burger. It's just one indication that can go in. What can you say about McDonald's? Well, it might be the most popular, but it's not the best.
Yeah. And that's a great, I liked what you said about they're indicators, not dictators. And what I'm also appreciating is this conversation is really helping people realize, myself included, how we have to be, as leaders, we have to be sophisticated about what we're looking at and ask the question beneath the thing, because it says something, but it's never the whole story.
Exactly.
Well, we're wildly successful, we're wildly a failure. It's like, well, that's all right. What's actually going on here? Like colleges that serve a lot of underserved populations, transit, like military populations, or people that move a lot, or they don't have a lot of money. They go, well, your 6-year graduation rate's abysmal. It's like, well, look at who we're serving. It's not. They get there eventually, but some of the things we can't measure is they went to 3 colleges or 4 colleges. How do we track that? Who gets to count? And so how do we, that's one of the things that people.
Who said that 4 years is successful? Who's to
Yeah.
say that 6 years isn't a successful outcome for particular populations? That's like how good is good, and that gets
or 8 years, whatever that is,
And so
now, if there's things internally, so one of the things that I always was curious about, if students weren't being able to get out in the 4 or 6 year frame, is there something we're doing? Like, are we not offering enough sequential courses in the specific majors so they can leave on time?
Are we putting up administrative barriers that is just too hard to overcome because we're not willing to look at our business processes from the consumer's point of view? So
Right.
Yes, we should always be looking inward to this and be willing to take some of the onus of that and not always put it on the student being deficient in some way for not graduating in 4 years. And I think this really leads into my second issue with KPIs is that the idea of progression versus targets. So KPIs on their own don't lead to improvement. They need other information, like you said, what's going on underneath. And so when you think about continuous improvement, it really requires sustained motivation toward meaningful change. And this is fostered by actionable progression toward outcomes. And then quantifiable targets such as KPIs really can be counterproductive. And first, let me just say, when you set these targets, I get them. I get targets. It's from psychology. We need kind of rungs on a ladder towards a goal. But when we're talking about something like student success, and we're saying we're going to increase the graduation rate by 20% in the next 4 years, I take issue with that because really the only morally defensible target is all students succeed. So just the fact of setting that people are getting left out and being excluded in that is a moral issue, I think.
So explain I don't understand. Can you explain what you mean by if we increase by 20%, we're leaving people
So if
out?
you think about, like, I know in California we have a GI 25, 2025, which is a graduation initiative, which is to increase our graduation rates. And so every year we want to increase rates by this much to get to a certain target. And so you have to do that when you're goal setting. You know, if you're going to lose weight, I'm going to lose a pound a week. You kind of set these targets. But when you're thinking of, like, if we really think about what student success is, and you're saying we want to increase it to so our graduation rate is like 80% or 90%, whatever that is, you're leaving out the other. So it's okay for 10% to fail. It's
Oh,
okay for 10% not to graduate. What makes that okay? So I think that there needs to be more intentional thought around the ethics of setting targets like that, what message that's sending for our mission. But the thing is that these targets can be perceived as arbitrary if they're not evidence based, and it's really hard to put something in evidence, like what's doable in a year, what's doable in 10 years. We don't know. We just know we need to move the needle. And so when you have it marked against you as missing a target, a seemingly non-evidential or arbitrary target, it really is demotivating and offers little direction for exactly how to improve. So getting it deemed as an individual, a unit, a division, a VP, motivationally, you feel powerless because you're not seeing that happen. So if you focus on these more interim outcomes and see the progression versus missing the target, that offers a clearer roadmap to improvement. So it's not that we shouldn't have them at kind of a high level, but understand how not to wield them in a way that is counterproductive to people's motivation and sustained motivation.
that's really interesting. I've led strategic planning workshops and for across nonprofits and for-profit companies. And I go, okay, what's our target? You got to have something. You got to have a goal. And everyone doesn't want to put a number on. No one wants to put a number. That's like, you're not going to achieve anything if you don't put a number down. But what you're sharing is what their concern is you're going to punish me if I don't reach this thing. And so I'd rather not have a thing. So you don't make, so there's no progress because sometimes you can't get it. Sometimes you just have to guess.
Yes.
But it's that thing. What I hear you saying that's so interesting is here's a target we're putting out there. So we are moving forward. And if we see progression, that will count. And if we're not seeing much progression, let's talk about it. But usually
Yeah.
I'm going to use it, Jennifer. Like if you report to me, I'll beat you up if you don't.
Yes.
Why
Because
didn't you achieve that?
the pressure to get those rates. I mean, it's real. I think as a management tool, you know, you're not going to talk at a board about all the things under it because those, like I said, the allure of the indicator. But when you're dealing with people in complex systems, yes, you need a target. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but make sure that you have some rationale for what that is, that it's not arbitrary. Make sure that you have people involved in setting it and getting their input. So there's ownership of that. So it doesn't feel like it's being done to them. And so that when it does, if you overachieve, great. If you underachieve, here are the reasons why. Maybe we need to adjust that. So I think it's just the feeling of it being done unto you rather than you being involved in the process and having clear rationale, because it can be counterproductive when this is coming from the top down. You feel powerless.
Yeah, that's so interesting because sometimes when I was at the university, we passed something to develop a 4-year online only degree, $15,000 all in. And a lot of like, I don't know. It's like, and you're feeling like they probably felt like the board is trying to do this to us. From a board perspective, is like, we have the smartest people on the planet working for us. We could figure this out if we really wanted to. We could, they put a man on the moon in the 60s. It's like, we can figure this stuff out now. And we have people figuring out the age of the universe. And putting satellites in space. You can't tell me that this is more complicated than that. And so it's that interesting push pull. As a leader, it's like, sometimes I need to set it, but I also understand if I don't provide you all the support that you need to possibly get there, and invite people. The one thing we did do correctly was invite people that were interested to play,
Yeah.
not force people that weren't interested to play in that sandbox.
And then,
So
and
that's really
then,
interesting.
yes. And then part of the evaluative process isn't just happening somewhere else removed from the people closest to the work. They should be involved in making sense of the evidence that you're obtaining on their programs, and talk to them. This is what we're finding. What does this mean? Why could this be? And opening that level of trust. And they're the ones closest to the work. You should be talking to them about it rather than having, an all-knowing kind of entity saying, uh, pass, fail,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. There's been a lot of talk on campuses for a long time, but really lately about campus culture and campus climate and how welcoming it is to different types of students, staff, and faculty. And a lot of campuses, most probably do a campus climate survey. And how do you think those go? And how can good measurement be used by university leadership boards to help drive campus climate change to be more welcoming, more inclusive, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so a lot about this because culture is a thing. It's not just a buzzword, and I'm very intentional about. Don't believe in engineering culture. It's be careful with it. Be intentional about it, right? So, I think when we're talking about that welcoming climate, kind of like that DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion for
Hmm.
students, faculty, and staff, it's important. And if you can have window dressing, or you can really have a culture that supports that. And we talk about culture as this iceberg, or the tippy top of that iceberg, or the espoused values. As we say, we value diversity. These are the behaviors and practices you can actually observe. But when you go under the water and look at that, under the iceberg, the wider part are the harder things, the assumptions, the values, the mental models, how we really feel about what's happening around here. And that's harder to actually change. It's possible over time, but those are the values that are driving the behavior. So, if you
How do you find out how do I find out what those underlying values are? Is there a survey instrument that can be developed?
survey will typically is really good at getting at the top above the water. Is
Okay.
get a
How do I get that?
it takes like the ethnographies, the case studies, talking to people.
What do you mean by ethnography?
Well, I think a deep study of like, I guess you could say, focus groups, and really getting people to trust and work with them over time. It's not just coming in quickly as a consultant, as a snapshot. Having someone embedded, like you think about someone going to a different culture in a different country and really living with them and getting to know their ways and kind of outlining and describing the cultural norms of that group. It's the same in an organization, right? And you have to have someone skilled enough to understand what we're saying isn't really what we believe. And I think you've worked in enough places to know that.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And also it's not as explicit as that. So we're complex organizations. There's a lot of tensions. There's contradictions, even in my personal life as well as work life. So I think you have to be aspirational about some of this, and you can measure your way there if you have the difficult conversations. If you do this if you have a climate of trust with your stakeholders, and they can talk about, I don't feel included here. I have a scenario from a colleague that's doing a lot of DEI work on a campus, and there's this executive board, a committee. We love committees. Who's doing this DEI work, and they were looking at some data for faculty. They have their survey data, they have their demographic data, and they conclude we're looking pretty good on DEI for faculty. So they're in this kind of developmental meeting where they're doing a retreat, and they have a consultant running it, and they do a straw poll. What proportion of people here feel like they're included in the campus community? These are the people closest to DEI work at the campus. Okay, the most diverse people who are knowledgeable about this. 35% said they did not feel included. Okay, I don't think that's okay. If they're not feeling that way when they're closest to the work and pushing this, what does the rest of the campus feel? So you need leaders that are courageous and brave to hear that. And they have to be willing to look in the mirror and say, is this subset of people feeling like this, and unpack it and understand. So that's getting at that qualitative notion of what you're talking about. A survey didn't really get at that root of what's happening.
And then you brought up a very good point about what's the permissible. So there's a point where um, if I feel good about my job or not feel good about my job, part of that's on me, right? If I graduate in 4 years or 6 years, part of that's on me. And so as we look at, so 35% of the people closest to the work seems really, really high that they would be left out because they're closest to the work. How do we begin to, and there probably isn't an answer to this, how do we begin to go 15%, 20% of people are going to be unhappy no matter what, versus these are concrete, when you got 40, 50%, you got a major problem.
Yes.
And I'm not
Okay.
talking, and I'm not,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm just like, how do we, you're as a psychologist, your background, it's like, and some people, how do we go, okay, well,
What's just the acceptable collateral damage? What's the baseline that we're going to get in a bureaucratic, work to rule, unionized environment with those people? I'm sorry, not to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of what you're dealing with in a big bureaucracies, right? And the thing, the key I'm keying on in what you said, it's not about unhappy. It's not. I'm not.
I just threw
Yeah.
that. I threw
No,
that
but I
out.
think
Yeah.
that it's you got to really measure the construct of interest. And it's not about happiness. It's about are you included as a valued partner? Are you engaged in your work? Do you feel like your work is meaningful? Those are better to flesh out than like a generalized happiness because I can.
That's great. Thank you for calling me on that. That's
No,
great.
because I
Yeah.
mean, there's days that I'm in a good mood and I'm happy at work, and there's other days it's drudgery, it's hard, but it's challenging, and so I'm not happy, but I'm in it to win it, and I know I'm making a difference. So you have to really, I think what you're saying is what's an acceptable level versus not acceptable level depends on the trajectory of your own institution and your history and what you're trying to aspire toward, what your mission is for your stakeholders. And if you've historically had a problem and you're trying to make it better, you need to listen to what they're saying and come up with ways that, okay, we're improving. But I think that when you have to be very careful to not discount certain voices as that's just the usual suspects of dissatisfaction, because really when you're judging the health of a system, and the effectiveness as a system, it's only as good as the ability it can serve its most marginalized vulnerable people. So if you're not hitting that, it doesn't matter. Right. So I think that's really a litmus test for where leaders need to be brave and hear some news that's not going to make them feel good.
Yeah. It's super. And the way you've articulated that is incredibly helpful. Because it's easy to go, well, they're just like faculty, they're just malcontents all the time. You're never going to make them happy or fill in the blank. And
Right.
that's being so dismissive of that. Or, well, the students in this dorm are always unhappy. Well, maybe because the dorm sucks. It's
Yeah,
like there's
exactly.
things that we got to look at. And I really appreciate, like, as a board member, it's like, what's the acceptable crime rate on campus?
Exactly.
Zero.
Zero. That's the
Zero.
acceptable crime rate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
However, we could never hit that.
Hmm.
And so how do we begin to do this risk management? These are incredibly complicated conversations, especially at public institutions. You never want to have those conversations in public because every parent will go, the crime rate, especially for assaults and sexual assaults, and like the acceptable rate's none. But how do you begin to go, okay, we need to interject here? And so that comes into the question of, you've got 10%, is that acceptable, of people that are not feeling engaged? You've
Right.
got 20%. Well, hold on a second. You got 30. Well, we got a major problem. Like, how do you begin to figure that out?
And then what are
Is
we
it, is
doing
it,
about it? Right.
and
And
then
for the
how much?
crime rate, how fast is the response time? So you measure something else like, okay, this is the crime rate. We theoretically can't get it to zero, but what we can do is the response time to someone getting assaulted in the library from campus police has gone down from this to this. So it's
Perfect.
showing again that
Yeah.
progression that we're trying to fix these things.
Hmm.
And those other measurements that underlie these indicators can help people understand the progress that we're making.
Yeah. Boy, this is really complicated. I just wanted a dashboard indicator. How hard is that?
That's what everybody wants. Are we in the red or the green or the yellow? Give me a gold
Yeah.
star. Yeah, you just want
Yeah.
that. Yeah, and you want it replicable. That's the other thing. It's like, okay, if someone in Stratcom or president's office is kind of solely charged for these, what does this mean? What do these dashboards mean? That's on one person's interpretation. We really need multiple people doing that so that we're compensating for people's biases, that we're eliminating the amount of error in these ratings, because I'm a big believer in collective ratings on like a rubric, but I also want it systematized and replicable so that if I give it to another group of stakeholders, we still come out with a green or at least adjacent to a green, right? That's what you want, that reliability. You don't want that, well, I think we're doing good because the 10%. So if we get more people involved in the process of making sense out of the evidence, there's more ownership and kind of the responsibility of those the progression towards those outcomes.
Yeah. I have a new appreciation, and we're going to do one more question, but I have a new appreciation of how absolutely complicated this is and how much care needs to go into it, especially around all the issues, but especially like campus culture. That's really important for students and faculty and staff to feel welcome. We know that a lot of first generation students and traditionally marginalized students haven't felt welcomed on campus. And it's like, and we keep failing at that, especially at the flagship institutions. So how do, there are things that we need to keep looking at and being honest about where we are failing and saying, we're not doing this right. The, at small and large institutions, we created processes to serve us, right? Oh, we need a process to get this done. I need an expense report. We need to do this. We need to develop a degree. We need to do this. But after time, a lot of times the process stops serving us and we start serving the process. As an evaluator, what's a way that you could suggest to leaders, campus leaders, boards to go, okay, we need to look at how we do this, our current processes. And then how do you evaluate, like, oh, we need to tweak this. This was developed 15 years ago. The world has changed dramatically. And especially the last 20 years, things have changed. But, we might be dealing with something that's 10 or 15 years old, not think like, oh, this is way out of date.
I think what I hear you saying is an interesting question. What I think is embedded in your question is that, like, we're serving, this is the way we've always done it, and we stop kind of questioning why we're doing it. Is it
Serving us anymore?
Or it's like, we exist as a program. We've always existed as a program. If we don't justify our services, then we'll get, deleted or something. So to me, it's interesting because I think it really asks an institution to be vulnerable and to risk self-perpetuation.
Stop. Yeah, forget it. If it's vulnerability, we're not doing it.
Okay. Let me use less psychological. let me use a less.
I'm joking because at the board level, there are no bad faculty, right? Everything's going well all the time. If there's a problem, we've already cleaned it up.
Well, that's toxic positivity. I mean, you gotta be dealing with facts, but you can do it in a strength-based way. Yeah. So, the fact is that big institutions are self-perpetuating. Okay. And you're going to risk that self-perpetuation when you start asking questions like that. Don't rock the boat. We don't really want to. And I've had a lot of this with assessment. When I was building this culture in student affairs, it's like, is this going to get tied to my budget? I'm like,
oh, best question ever.
Do you know how budgets work around here anyways? It's a little bit opaque. We're not even close to that. We're not rigorous enough for that. Okay. So, I mean, ideally, maybe we could, but that's a long way coming because we're just getting the capability of being able to accurately self-assess ourselves. So, in higher ed, it's weird. We kind of move at this glacial speed until we don't. There seems like a lot of slowness, a lot of committee meetings, and things don't happen until all of a sudden, boom. So you better be ready. There's a lot of cultivation that happens, and when it's ready to pop, you can go. That's what I found. The pandemic was the best example of this. We pivoted just great. Thank you very much. Never thought we could because we're not nimble. You know what I mean? We just don't see ourselves like that because we're large institutions. But that being said, it kind of creates this breeding ground for that, like I said, the self-perpetuation, and we stop questioning the process. It's the way we've always done it. So I think the remedy for this, how to ameliorate this, is really evaluative thinking. Needs to be expected, trained, rewarded, and reinforced. So that includes a lot of things, that process of self-reflection, really looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it has to happen from the top down. The leaders have to model this so that you're innovating and failing forward and not getting dinged.
Yeah.
And this takes strength of leadership. It's not easy when that pressure is on you to hit these metrics. I think also more rapid assessment cycles. So a lot of times if you're doing a self-study in academic affairs, student affairs, we kind of do self-studies too. It's like on a 5-year cycle or something like that. Let's do something a little more rapid, less rigorous, to keep our fingers on the pulse. It doesn't have to be a randomized controlled trial. We're not proving causality here. We're just trying to do the best we can for our students. And that comes from such a variety and wealth of information. Keep this more rapid. So we're staying more, like I said, nimble and agile. So I think also more empowerment toward the people closest to work to make those changes and adjustments. I mean, that's hard to do in a deep hierarchy, but we got to trust our folks to know that they're experts in what they're doing, periodically consulting with the people closest to the work about the work. So oftentimes at the top, decisions are being made. And it's like, why didn't you talk to me? I could have told you It would
I
be
wasn't going to do it.
easy in
Yeah.
a conversation, just a conversation about this, in a climate of trust where I could tell you the truth in that conversation.
Mhm.
Right. And so I'm not like legitimizing turf protection. So in higher ed, I think we're really good at coming up with programs and policies and services for students, but we're less great at sunsetting them because that's threatening to folks. So we have to really bring in good self evaluation. We have the privilege of being in a system where there's so much self determination here and a campus full of smarty pants. Let's start using all that knowledge and expertise and kind of like it needs to go out into the world. Yes, that's our mission, but can we put some of it back inward towards ourselves to improve from within?
Well, this has been a really terrific conversation. And Jennifer, we didn't get to a number of questions, but we kind of knew that was probably going to happen. Um, did I not? Did you want to share anything that I didn't ask or that you thought of while we're talking that we didn't cover?
I don't know.
Without,
I think that
yeah.
was great, great
Okay.
conversation.
I always like to end by asking my guests, what do you like most about working in higher education?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Not that I'm in an existential crisis or anything, but I think that it's an interesting answer. I think my answer to that is also what I find hardest about working in higher ed, and that's the challenge of change. The synergy and collaboration that I have amongst colleagues who really care about this endeavor of transforming lives. I've really had good fortune to be surrounded by top-notch people. The fact that I get to apply my discipline in a practical way that helps leaders. And that's the thing about continuous improvement. It's ever onward and it really suits my character and principles, but this challenge of change is near and dear to my heart. So it's the best thing and the hardest thing. So I guess
I think that's a great summary. I think that's a lot of us experience that. We love it and it drives us bananas at the same time.
just
Right?
being honest. Can't be.
Yeah. No, that's great. I love being a regent and it drove me crazy on a regular basis.
That means you're probably doing a good job.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I did. Anyway, thanks again, Jennifer. This is a great conversation.
Thanks so much. So fun talking to you, Steve.